March of 1199. Southern France. A man is standing outside a small castle watching his engineers work. He is not wearing full armor. The castle is nothing. The garrison inside numbers maybe 40 men. The whole thing will be over in a few days. His name is Richard, King of England. The man Saladin could not beat in open battle. The man who survived a shipwreck, a kidnapping, 14 months in a German prison, and 30 years of his own family trying to destroy him. He is 41 years old, standing in the late afternoon sun without his armor on, because this place is not worth the trouble of putting it on. On the wall above him, a young soldier is holding a frying pan in one hand and a crossbow in the other. He is using the pan as a shield. Richard sees him. By one account, Richard actually laughs. There is something about the sheer stubbornness of it. One man with a cooking pan standing against the army of the most dangerous king in Europe that appeals to him in a way he cannot quite explain. Then the bolt hits. Left shoulder. Not a killing shot. Not even serious by the standards of a man who has been collecting wounds since he was 16. Richard walks back to his tent and tries to pull it out himself in the dark. He makes it worse. A surgeon finishes the job badly. The wound turns. Gangrene spreads. 12 days later, Richard the Lionheart is dead. He survived Saladin. He survived the crusade. He survived the storms and the prison and the betrayals. And he died outside a castle no one will remember. In a war no one needed, because he did not think the moment was dangerous enough to take seriously. His mother Eleanor rode through the night to reach him. She was 77 years old. She made it in time. What they said to each other in those final hours, no one recorded. What we know is that the woman who made Richard the Lionheart was holding his hand when the Lionheart died. And the question that his death leaves behind is not why he died outside Châlus. The question is how a man who had survived everything could look at that castle in that moment and not see it coming. To answer that, you have to go back to the beginning, not his beginning. Hers. Start with a map, not the England you picture when someone says English king. The world Richard was born into stretched from the Scottish border in the north all the way down to the Pyrenees Mountains in the south. It included Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine, held together not by shared identity or nationality, but by military force, strategic marriages, and the constant management of people who were always calculating whether loyalty or rebellion served them better this week. Henry II ruled this empire, and by almost any honest measure, he was one of the most capable rulers of the medieval world. He reformed English law. He built a court system that outlasted him by centuries. He managed a territory larger than most of his contemporaries could imagine governing. He was also, in the specific way that very powerful men who never stop working tend to be, a catastrophic father. He did not think in terms of children. He thought in terms of heirs, assets, and political investments. His sons were instruments through which he would extend and stabilize his dynasty. Their personalities, their needs, their private lives were factors to be managed, not relationships to be cultivated. Eleanor of Aquitaine saw this about her husband earlier than most people understood anything. She had been Queen of France before she was Queen of England. Her first marriage, to Louis VII, ended in annulment after 15 years because Louis needed a son, and Eleanor had come to understand with the particular clarity of someone trapped in a situation that does not suit them, that she was never going to be what Louis needed. She was too much, too opinionated, too political, too unwilling to disappear into the decorative role that the French court required. She married Henry 2 months after the annulment. She was 30. He was 19. For a time, it was a genuine partnership. They were too similar not to understand each other, and too similar not to eventually become competitors. Aquitaine came with Eleanor. This matters enormously. Aquitaine was the richest, most culturally sophisticated duchy in France, a place where the troubadour tradition had elevated poetry, music, and the performance of honor into something approaching a way of life. Eleanor had grown up in this world. She carried it with her, and when she had children, she raised them inside it. Richard was born on the 8th of September, 1157, at Beaumont Palace in Oxford. He was the third son. Above him were Henry, called the young king, who was his father's designated heir to England and Normandy, and Geoffrey, assigned to Brittany. Below him eventually came John, the youngest, the one Henry kept close and called his favorite. Being the third son in this family meant something specific, important enough to be trained and positioned and used, not important enough to be the center of anyone's long-term planning. Richard got a kitten. Eleanor arranged this when Richard was 11 years old. She spent the following years preparing him for it with an intensity that tells you she understood something about this particular child that was worth investing in. She taught him the culture of the South, the poetry, the music, the elaborate codes of courtly honor that turned personal conduct into a kind of public statement. She gave him languages. She gave him the understanding that power was not only about force, it was about performance, about making people believe in something greater than the sword being pointed at them. Henry II gave his sons something different. He gave them the example of a man who was always moving, always solving, always managing the next crisis. The empire ran on the person at its center. Stop moving, and the whole thing begins to come apart. Richard absorbed both lessons completely. He never questioned either of them. He spent his life proving both of them true. The household he grew up in was magnificent, chaotic, multilingual, and fundamentally unsafe. His parents' marriage, which had begun as something like genuine partnership, was, by the time Richard was a teenager, a Cold War conducted through contested territories and the quiet weaponization of children. Henry did not trust Eleanor. Eleanor did not trust Henry. And the boys who were supposed to inherit what they had built together grew up watching two extraordinarily capable people treat their marriage like a battlefield. Richard learned the answer to what this meant when he was 16. His father summoned him. The conversation was about Aquitaine, about loyalty, about whether Richard was his mother's son or his father's. The answer Henry wanted was clear. Richard walked out of that meeting and began planning a rebellion. The rebellion of 1173 was, in military terms, a failure. Henry crushed it. Eleanor, who had openly supported her sons, was captured and imprisoned. She would remain in captivity for the next 16 years. But Richard was not trying to win. He was 16 years old. What he was trying to find out was what happened when he stopped obeying. He found out that he lost. His mother went to prison, and he was forced to kneel and recite the words of submission that political reality required, and he found out something else, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had chosen his side, knowing the cost. He had lost, and he was still himself. Henry looked at his third son after the rebellion ended and saw what Eleanor had always seen, and what Henry had always been slightly afraid of, a person who could not be managed. You could defeat him, you could outmaneuver him, you could force him to his knees, but you could not bend him toward purposes that were not his own. He had his mother's intelligence and his father's relentlessness, combined into something neither of his parents had individually. He was someone who genuinely did not care what happened to him as long as it happened on his own terms. That quality would make him the most feared military commander in the world. It would also be the thing that left him standing outside Châlus without his armor on. There is a song Richard wrote in a German prison. He composed it in 2 languages at the same time, Occitan and Old French, which tells you something about the man and the world that made him. The song is about captivity, about being forgotten. It asks whether his friends and companions have abandoned him now that he is locked away and cannot do anything for them. It is, by the standards of 12th century lyric poetry, genuinely good. Most people who hear that Richard the First of England wrote poetry are surprised. They should not be. He did not write poetry despite being a warrior. He wrote poetry because in the world Eleanor built around him. The 2 things were not separate. They were both expressions of the same idea. That a man worth remembering was a man who could fight brilliantly and feel deeply and put that feeling into language. Not a contradiction. The ideal. Eleanor gave him this, completely and deliberately. She had grown up at the court of her grandfather, William IX, one of the earliest and most celebrated troubadour poets in the French tradition. The culture she inherited was one where the highest form of human achievement was not conquest alone, but the combination of martial excellence and refined feeling. A man who could ride into a siege at dawn and write a song about what he had lost by nightfall was not confused about his identity. He was whole. She gave this to Richard from the time he was old enough to hold a pen. When Henry assigned Aquitaine to Richard and Eleanor took charge of shaping him, she was not simply teaching him to administer a duchy. She was teaching him what a great man looked like. The language of honor, of loyalty, of what a lord owes the people who follow him. The understanding that your reputation is not vanity. It is the most durable thing you will ever own. It is the only thing that survives you. Richard took all of it in, with the complete attention that certain children give to lessons that feel, at some deep and unexamined level, like the truth about who they already are. He had found the framework that fit him. And here is exactly where the gift and the curse become the same thing. The troubadour ideal that Eleanor gave Richard was built around a specific kind of man, the knight who rides out, the lord who leaves his castle to prove himself in the wider world, the hero whose greatness is demonstrated precisely by his willingness to abandon the comfortable and familiar in pursuit of something higher. Presence was domestic. Absence was heroic. Eleanor knew this framework had a cost. She had governed Aquitaine herself. She had run England as regent during Henry's long absences. She understood, better than almost anyone in Europe, that the work of actually keeping a kingdom functioning was mostly the work of being there, of showing up on the days when nothing dramatic happened, of managing the 1,000 small decisions that never made it into any chronicle, but without which the whole thing quietly falls apart. She understood this, and she built a son who could not do it. This is not an accusation. She was doing the best she could with what she had. In a marriage that had become a war, raising a child in a world that offered him one clear path to greatness and no obvious alternative. She gave him the best she had. She gave him an idea of himself that was magnificent and true. In the end, impossible to live inside of without leaving everyone who depended on him behind. In 1173, when Richard was 16, Eleanor was arrested. Henry had her taken into custody for supporting the rebellion. She would spend the next 16 years in captivity, moved from one location to another, always comfortable enough to survive, never free enough to act. Richard was in Aquitaine when it happened. He was now governing her land in her name, fighting her wars, managing her duchy, building his own reputation on the foundation she had given him. He was doing all of this for a woman he could not visit, sending letters to a mother he could not reach. The idea she had handed him, that a great man is defined by what he does and not by where he stays, was the only living piece of her he had left. He held it like it was the last thing she had touched. He held it for the rest of his life. And in 16 years of a German prison and an Austrian castle, and the long cold rooms of a woman who had once been queen of 2 countries, Eleanor held on to something too. She held on to the belief that what she had made was worth making. That when Richard finally had his crown, and his crusade, and his legend, the cost of building him would turn out to have been worth paying. She would spend the rest of her life finding out whether she was right. In 1189, Henry II died at the castle of Chinon. He had been broken by a final rebellion led by Richard with the support of the French king, and by the news, delivered to him as he lay dying, that John had been among the conspirators. John, his favourite, the one he had kept closest. Henry turned his face to the wall. He did not recover. Richard arrived at Chinon and knelt beside his father's bed. What passed between them in those final hours? The chronicles do not fully record. What they record is that when Henry's face was washed after his death, blood ran from his nose as Richard stood over him. Medieval observers read this as accusation from beyond death. Modern readers understand it as coincidence. What matters more than the blood is the fact that Richard stood there and felt something complicated enough that no simple word covers it. He arranged his father's burial with appropriate ceremony. Then he sent a letter. It went to his mother. It told her she was free. It gave her full authority to act in his name throughout England, to release prisoners, to receive oaths, to make decisions, to govern. He did not wait to see her first. He trusted her completely, immediately, and without reservation. Eleanor received that letter and understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it cost her son to mean it. She had spent 16 years waiting for the world to change. The world had changed. She did not waste a day. Here is something that gets lost when people talk about the Plantagenet family. They were not simply a dysfunctional royal family in the way that most royal families are dysfunctional, through vanity and jealousy and the ordinary smallness that power brings out in ordinary people. They were dysfunctional in a specific and structural way that Henry II had built into the system himself. Henry had solved the succession problem by crowning his eldest son Henry during his own lifetime. The young king was declared King of England, while his father was still king. He was crowned, celebrated, given the title, and then given nothing to actually do. No land to govern, no decisions to make, no way to be a king except in the ceremonial sense that satisfied no one. Least of all, a young man who had been told since birth that he was destined for the throne. The young Henry was magnificent in the way that decorative objects are magnificent. Beautiful, expensive, admired, and fundamentally without purpose. He wanted to be real. His father would not let him be real. Geoffrey, assigned Brittany, was by most accounts the most genuinely dangerous of the brothers. Intelligent, politically gifted, patient in a way that Richard never was, and completely without sentiment. When it came to getting what he wanted, he would have been a formidable king. He died in 1186 at a tournament in Paris, trampled by horses, and the medieval world moved on without pausing to consider what it had lost. John was the youngest, Henry's favourite, kept close and indulged and protected in ways that did not prepare him for anything except the specific art of surviving inside a family that consumed its own members. And then there was Richard, the third son, not the heir, not the spare, not the favourite, the one who had been given Aquitaine and told to make something of it. He made something of it. When the rebellion of 1173 came, Richard was 16. He joined it because Eleanor was involved, and because Henry had spent years making it clear that Richard's position was conditional on his usefulness, and because, at 16 years old, after a childhood spent watching two extraordinarily capable people treat each other like enemies, Richard had developed a specific and unshakable conviction. The only power that was really yours was the power you were willing to fight for. The rebellion failed. Henry crushed it with the efficiency of a man who had been managing rebellions since before most of his opponents were born. Eleanor was arrested. The young Henry was forced to submit. Richard knelt and recited the words that the situation required. But something happened to Richard in that rebellion that did not happen to his brothers. He found out that losing did not break him. The young Henry, when he lost, became smaller, more anxious, more dependent on the validation of people who admired him for things he had not actually done. He spent the years after 1173 chasing glory at tournaments and in minor campaigns, collecting the appearance of a warrior's reputation, without ever putting himself in the kind of situation where a reputation was genuinely at stake. Richard, when he lost, went back to Aquitaine and got to work. He put down rebellions. He took castles. He built a military reputation that was not borrowed from his father's name or his family's prestige. He earned it in the specific and irreducible way that military reputations are earned, which is by being in the field, under pressure, and being better than the person on the other side. He fought his father twice more after 1173. The second time, in 1183, the young Henry was involved. He died during that campaign of dysentery, sick and broke in a minor French town, sending messages to Richard asking him to come. Richard did not come, whether this was distrust, or military necessity, or the specific coldness that had developed between them over years of competing for the same limited resources of a father's attention. No source fully explains. The young Henry died without seeing him. Richard grieved, or he did something that the people around him understood as grief, which was to become very quiet and very focused, and to throw himself into the next campaign with an energy that had an edge to it that had not been there before. Geoffrey died 3 years later. The tournament, the horses, the crowd that did not understand what it was watching until it was too late. And then it was Richard and John, and a father who was running out of sons to play against each other, and a world that was about to change completely. In 1187, Jerusalem fell to Saladin. Richard heard the news in Aquitaine. He took the cross within months. He made a public vow before witnesses that he would go to the Holy Land and recover what had been lost. He did not consult his father. Henry was furious. England needed Richard. The Angevin Empire needed Richard. The idea that the most militarily capable member of the family was going to spend the next several years fighting in the Middle East was, from a purely strategic standpoint, Exactly the kind of decision that a responsible heir to a major European power should not make unilaterally. Richard understood all of this. He took the cross anyway, because this is who Eleanor had made him. A man who, when something mattered enough, did not ask for permission. Henry II spent the next 2 years trying to find a way to keep Richard in Europe. Richard spent the same 2 years looking for allies who would help him force the issue. He found the most useful and most dangerous one available, Philip II of France. Philip was 22 years old and already one of the sharpest political operators on the continent. He understood immediately that the chaos inside the Plantagenet family was his opportunity. He and Richard made an alliance built on mutual benefit and mutual distrust, which is to say they made exactly the kind of alliance that actually holds in the medieval world, where shared interest is more reliable than shared affection. They drove Henry to his final defeat at Chinon. Henry died looking at a list of betrayers, with John's name at the top of it. Richard stood over his father's body and felt whatever complicated thing he felt. Then he sent the letter that freed his mother. Then he became king. And the first thing he did with the crown was look around for a way to use it to get to Jerusalem. There is a castle in the Dordogne Valley called Tailbourg. In 1179, it was considered impregnable. The lords who held it had spent years building that reputation carefully, and they had good reason to believe it. The castle sat on a rocky promontory above the Charente River, with sheer drops on 3 sides and walls thick enough to outlast almost any conventional siege. Previous attempts had failed. The local nobility had drawn a quiet conclusion from those failures. Tailbourg was the kind of place you went around, not through. Richard went through it in 3 days. He did not find some secret weakness in the walls. He did not discover a hidden entrance or bribe a guard or wait for disease to thin the garrison. He won by the application of pressure, so sustained and so completely indifferent to the concept of difficulty that the garrison eventually stopped making a military calculation and started making a human one. They looked at the man outside their walls and decided that whatever was inside the castle was not worth what continuing to resist him was going to cost them. That was Richard's real weapon in Aquitaine, not the trebuchets, though he was brilliant with trebuchets, not the engineering, though his instinct for siege mechanics was exceptional. His real weapon was something harder to explain and harder to defend against. He did not see Tailbourg as impregnable. He saw it as a problem with a solution he had not found yet. The difference between those 2 ways of looking at a wall is the entire difference between a commander his men would follow into impossible situations and a commander his men would follow only into manageable ones. Richard could get people to walk toward walls that were actively dropping stones on them, because when they looked at his face, they did not see a man who had accepted the possibility of failure. They saw a man who had not yet had that conversation with himself. Aquitaine, in the 1170s and 80s, was not the peaceful, sun-drenched land of troubadour poetry that Eleanor's court had made famous. It was a region of deeply independent nobles who had been resisting central authority for generations, who had their own networks of alliance and enmity, and who had developed a particular expertise in the kind of persistent, low-level insurgency specifically designed to exhaust whoever was trying to govern them. They had not met Richard yet. He arrived as their duke with a simple and brutally effective approach. He would demonstrate, as many times as necessary, that rebelling against him cost more than not rebelling against him. Not cheaper to submit, more expensive to resist. The distinction matters. He was not asking for love. He was asking for a specific calculation to produce a specific result. It mostly worked, but here is what needs to be said honestly about those years in Aquitaine, because it gets softened in most accounts of Richard's life. He was sometimes brutal in ways that went beyond any reasonable military calculation. When certain castles fell after long sieges, Richard's treatment of the garrisons was severe enough to make other garrisons surrender faster, which was, from a strictly operational standpoint, exactly what he intended. When nobles who had rebelled repeatedly were captured, they were not always treated with the courtesy that the chivalric tradition technically required for prisoners of equivalent standing. This was not psychopathy, it was policy. Richard had decided that the normal instruments of Aquitanian governance were not sufficient to the problem he had inherited. The region had learned that rebellion cost relatively little. He needed to change that lesson. He changed it, what he did not fully consider, or perhaps considered and accepted as a necessary cost, was what this approach built into the culture around him. The men who followed Richard in Aquitaine learned that violence was the primary language of power. They learned that mercy was a strategic choice rather than a default. They learned that the speed and totality of force applied was the measure of a commander's seriousness. These were useful lessons for a crusade. They were less useful for governing England. But England was not what Richard was thinking about during those 15 years in the south of France. He was thinking about what was directly in front of him, which was a duchy that needed to be controlled, and what was on the horizon, which was Jerusalem. The crusading idea had been in the air of Richard's entire life. He had grown up in a world where the recovery of the Holy Land was the highest aspiration a Christian knight could hold. Eleanor had gone on the Second Crusade with her first husband. The troubadour tradition was saturated with the imagery of holy war and the duty of the warrior to answer when the cause demanded. When Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, Richard had been Duke of Aquitaine for nearly a decade. He took the cross within months. He took it with the quality of commitment that characterized everything he did. Completely, immediately, and without any apparent internal debate about whether this was wise. The chronicles record that when he made the vow, people who were standing near him said they felt something shift in the room. Not a dramatic shift, something quieter and more serious than drama. The shift of a man who has just said out loud the thing he has been thinking about for years, and who means every word of it, and who is now done with the thinking portion of the process. He was going to Jerusalem. Everything else was logistics. Eleanor, still in captivity at this point, heard about the vow through the networks she maintained from behind her walls. She understood immediately what it meant, not just for Richard, for England, for the treasury, for the people who would be asked to fund it. She said nothing publicly. She began thinking about what was going to need managing when it actually happened. That was the specific quality Eleanor had that Richard never fully developed. She could see 3 moves ahead and hold all 3 in mind simultaneously, while still executing the first one. Richard could see 1 move ahead with a clarity and completeness that no one in Europe could match. But he could only really see 1 move at a time. The move he was seeing right now was Jerusalem. Everything after Jerusalem was a problem he would solve when he got there. He never got there, but that is getting ahead of the story. What matters here is what those 15 years in Aquitaine built into Richard's bones: the siege mechanics, the instinct for terrain and timing, the ability to read a military situation in the first few minutes and understand what it required, the way a doctor reads a patient or a carpenter reads a piece of wood, not by analyzing it consciously, but by seeing it. He was 31 years old when his father died, and the crown became his. He had been preparing for Jerusalem for 4 years. He was ready. The question that no one was asking in the summer of 1189, because it was not the kind of question that got asked in the Plantagenet court, was whether Jerusalem was ready for him. On the morning of the 28th of July, 1189, Eleanor of Aquitaine walked out of captivity. She had been held in various locations and with various degrees of comfort for 16 years. Most of the people she had known at the height of her power were dead. The political world she had spent decades navigating had been rearranged by 2 generations of conflict that she had experienced only through letters and rumors, and the specific distortions that enforced isolation produces in a person's understanding of everything outside their walls. She walked out into that changed world, and she began working within the hour. Richard's letter had given her full authority to act in his name throughout England. She used it. She travelled through the country at a pace that left younger people struggling to keep up. She heard petitions. She released prisoners from royal jails, particularly those held for minor offences that generated resentment without producing any meaningful benefit to the crown. She received oaths of loyalty. She made appointments. She was 67 years old, and she was doing in days what most regents took weeks to organise. When Richard arrived in England and they finally met, there is no record of what was said between them. We know she was there. We know he was there. We know 16 years had passed between the last time they had been in the same room and this moment. The rest belongs to silence. What the record does show is that within weeks of their reunion, Richard had appointed Eleanor to a level of authority in England that had no real precedent for a queen mother. She was not simply a figurehead. She was governing. She was making decisions. She was the person that the barons and clergy and administrators of England understood to be speaking for the crown when the crown was not present. Richard knew she would be good at it. He also knew he was going to need someone good at it, because he was not planning to be present very often. The coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of September, 1189. It was magnificent in the way that medieval coronations were magnificent. Elaborate, symbolic, expensive, and designed to communicate something specific about the nature of royal power to everyone who attended and everyone who would hear about it afterward. Richard played his part with the ease of a man who had been performing in front of audiences his entire life. He was tall, red-haired, physically imposing in a way that had nothing to do with size alone. He occupied space differently than other people. The air around him seemed to reorganize itself to acknowledge his presence. The crowd loved him immediately. This was not inevitable. Coronations produced mixed reactions. Richard arrived at Westminster, and the people who saw him felt, almost before he had done anything at all, that this was the kind of man the word king was originally designed to describe. Eleanor watched her son receive his crown and felt the thing that parents feel when the child they have raised becomes fully, irreversibly, publicly, the person they always suspected he was going to be. She did not record what that felt like. Outside the Abbey, that evening, violence spread through London. A group of Jewish community leaders had arrived bearing gifts for the new king and been turned away at the door. The crowd, taking the exclusion as a signal, did what crowds sometimes did with signals of that kind. Homes were attacked. People were killed. Richard was genuinely angry when he found out. He sent troops. He had several ringleaders punished. His response was real, and it was late, and it was not sufficient. The broader pattern of violence continued through the following months, culminating in the massacre at York in March of 1190, in which several hundred members of the Jewish community died. Richard was not in England when York happened. He had already moved on to the organising, because here is the truth about Richard and the crown of England. The truth that he demonstrated in the first weeks of his reign, before anyone fully understood what they were watching. He did not want to be the King of England. He wanted to be the king who used England to get to Jerusalem. These are not the same thing. And the difference between them would define his entire reign and the lives of everyone who depended on him. He began selling everything that could be sold: offices, privileges, charters, lands, the right to collect particular taxes in particular counties, appointments to positions in the church, and the administration that normally would have been granted based on competence and political relationship. All of it became available for the right price. He sold the governorship of Northumbria to the Bishop of Durham for £10,000. When an advisor suggested he was being reckless with the kingdom's institutional structures, Richard replied that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. Whether he actually said this, or whether it was attributed to him afterward, because it sounded like something he would say, it captures something real about his attitude toward England in this period. England was an asset, the largest and most liquid one in his portfolio. It existed in his understanding of his own situation, primarily to fund the thing he actually cared about. On a Tuesday morning, in the spring of 1190, a tax collector arrived at a farm in the Yorkshire Wolds. We do not know his name. We do not know the farmer's name. What we know is the amount written in the collector's ledger, a figure representing the Saladin tithe, a tax of 1/10 of all income and movable property, levied across England to fund the Third Crusade. The farmer had never been to Jerusalem. He had never seen the Mediterranean. He had been born within walking distance of where he stood, as had his father and his grandfather. His understanding of the wider world came from what the parish priest told him on Sundays. He paid the tax. He did not have a choice. This man is not one specific person so much as a way of seeing all the people the chronicles usually leave out. The ones who paid for Richard's legend with money they could not easily afford, in exchange for a story they would never be part of, and a city they would never see. 300 miles to the south, Eleanor was reading reports and making decisions and managing a kingdom that its king had already left behind in everything but name. She understood what was happening. She did not stop it. She could not stop it. And she would not have tried to, even if she could, because she had spent 30 years believing in what Richard was building toward. But she was already thinking about what was going to need fixing when it was over. In December of 1189, Richard left England for Normandy to continue his preparations. He took the money, the plans, and the absolute certainty that what he was doing was the most important thing a man of his position could do. He left behind Eleanor, and a kingdom that had been taxed and sold and organized entirely around his departure. He would not return for 4 years. The fleet left Messina in the spring of 1191, carrying somewhere between 200 and 250 ships. It was the largest naval force England had ever assembled, the product of 18 months of purchasing, requisitioning, building, and organizing that Richard had conducted with the same systematic energy he brought to every problem he genuinely cared about. The ships carried soldiers, horses, food, weapons, siege equipment, and the full administrative apparatus of a military campaign intended to last years in a theatre of operations 3,000 miles from home. They also carried, on a vessel toward the middle of the convoy, Richard's betrothed, Berengaria of Navarra, and his sister Joan, the widowed Queen of Sicily. The Mediterranean in spring does not owe anyone safe passage. A storm hit the fleet off the coast of Cyprus and scattered it across several hundred miles of open water. Most ships survived and regrouped. 3 did not, at least not in the way that mattered for what followed. One went down with a significant portion of the campaign treasury. another lost men whose absence would be felt later. The third carried Berengaria and Joan. Driven off course and forced to seek shelter in the harbour of Limassol on the island of Cyprus. The ruler of Cyprus in 1191 was a man named Isaac Komnenos. Isaac had seized control of the island in 1184 by presenting a forged imperial document to the Byzantine governor, and then, when the forgery was discovered, simply refusing to give up what he had taken. He had held Cyprus for 7 years against various attempts to remove him through a combination of the island's natural defensibility, his own ruthlessness, and the general inability of his enemies to focus on Cyprus when they had larger problems demanding their attention. He had developed, over 7 years, of holding a position that was not rightfully his. A ruler's instinct for identifying vulnerability. When the storm-damaged ships of Richard's fleet appeared in his harbour, Isaac saw opportunity. He refused to return the treasure, salvaged from the sunken vessel. He detained the survivors of the wrecks. He prevented Berengaria and Joan from coming ashore, leaving them aboard their damaged ship while he negotiated, or declined to negotiate, or simply waited to see what the situation would produce. Richard arrived at Cyprus on the 6th of May, 1191, to find his betrothed stranded in a harbour, his treasury claimed by a man with no legal right to it, and his people being held without cause. He sent a message to Isaac demanding the return of the treasure, the release of the survivors, and proper hospitality for Berengaria and Joan. Isaac refused. What happened next took 10 days. Richard landed troops on the beach at Limassol over active military resistance, fighting his way ashore under fire against a defending force that had the advantage of knowing the terrain. He defeated the Cypriot forces in a series of engagements that moved across the island with the speed that characterized Richard's operations when he had decided something needed to happen quickly. Isaac retreated. Richard pursued. Isaac offered to negotiate. Richard agreed to terms. Isaac violated the terms within days. Richard resumed the pursuit. When Isaac was finally captured, he asked not to be put in iron chains. Richard had promised him this. He agreed to the letter of the promise and had silver chains made for him instead. Cyprus fell in 10 days. This is remarkable even by Richard's standards. The island is approximately 150 miles long and 60 miles wide, with mountain ranges that should have complicated military operations significantly. The garrison Isaac had built over 7 years was not negligible. The logistical challenge of conducting operations across an island while simultaneously managing the repair of a storm-damaged fleet was substantial. Richard did it in 10 days because he moved faster than anyone had prepared for him to move. But here is what the speed of Cyprus actually reveals about Richard. The thing that matters more than the tactical achievement. He did not come to Cyprus to take it. He came to Cyprus because a storm had put his people in danger, and a local ruler had made the specific mistake of deciding that Richard's people were his to detain. Richard's response was not calculated. It was instinctive. He saw a situation that required force, and he applied force, and the application of force produced Cyprus as a side effect. And Cyprus would go on to serve as a critical crusader supply base for the next 3 centuries. He did not plan that. He could not have planned that. He arrived at a problem and solved it the only way he knew how to solve problems, which was to move toward them at full speed until they stopped being problems. This is who Eleanor had made. A man who could not look at a solvable problem and choose to wait. Cyprus was the clearest example yet of what that quality produced when things went well. Châlus, 23 years later, was what it looked like when things did not. Richard's wedding to Berengaria took place at Limassol on the 12th of May. 1191. 6 days after he had fought his way onto a beach under fire, the ceremony was conducted with appropriate religious formality. Richard wore a rose-coloured tunic embroidered with silver crescents and golden lions. The senior commanders and clergy of the crusading fleet stood as witnesses. Men who had been fighting through storms and Cypriot resistance for the past week, and who now watched their king get married in a chapel in a city he had taken 6 days ago. It was, by all accounts, a dignified ceremony. It was also, by those same accounts, and by everything that followed, a marriage of almost complete personal distance on Richard's part. Berengaria of Navarre was the daughter of King Sancho, the 6th of Navarre. The match had been arranged for reasons of political geography. She was, by the limited records that survive, intelligent and capable, and entirely suited to a life that Richard was never going to give her. She accompanied the fleet to the Holy Land. She spent most of the crusade in Acre, managing a household in a city that had just been taken from its previous inhabitants, in a region where everything about daily life was different from anything she had grown up with. She and Richard spent very little time together. He was always somewhere else. She would eventually return to Europe, outlive Richard by decades, and spend her later years in Maine, in a city called Le Mans, endowing a priory and governing her household, and living a life that the historical record describes with a respect that suggests she was genuinely capable and genuinely alone. She never remarried. She never publicly complained, whatever she thought about the man she had married in Cyprus on the 12th of May. 1191. 6 days after his army fought its way onto a beach. She kept it to herself for the rest of her life. Cyprus disappeared behind the fleet as it turned east toward Acre. Richard stood at the stern and watched the island go. What he saw was not Cyprus. He was already looking at the horizon. Jerusalem was 3 sailing days away. He had work to do. Richard arrived at Acre on the 8th of June, 1191, on a galley decorated with coloured lanterns and silk flags. He understood theatre. He understood that an army, which has been sitting in a disease-ridden camp for 2 years watching people die, does not need a general who arrives quietly. It needs to feel that something has changed, that the waiting is over, that the man who just appeared on that lantern-lit ship is the reason the situation is about to be different. The garrison inside Acre watched from the walls. Saladin's army watched from the hills. The Crusader camp that had been rotting on the beach for 23 months watched from below. Richard stepped off the ship. The camp erupted, not because they knew him. Most of them had never seen him. But he had something that certain commanders possess, and that no amount of reputation building fully explains. When he walked into a situation, people who had been exhausted felt less exhausted. People who had been losing felt the losing pull back slightly, not because anything had changed yet, because something about his presence said, in terms that bypassed rational thought and landed somewhere more primitive, that the situation was about to be different. Before Richard's arrival, the story of the siege needs to be understood. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187. The fall did not happen because Saladin was invincible. It happened because the Crusader army walked into a trap it had built for itself. Marching in summer heat across a waterless ridge above the Sea of Galilee called the Horns of Hattin, without sufficient water, against an enemy who simply had to wait for thirst to finish the work. The Crusader army at Hattin destroyed itself. Saladin did not need genius. He needed patience. After Jerusalem fell, The remaining Crusader forces had gathered to besiege Acre, the most important port in the region, but the besiegers were themselves besieged by Saladin's army surrounding their camp. Three forces locked together in a ring of mutual exhaustion. Disease killing people on all sides. The whole thing frozen in place for nearly 2 years. Philip of France had arrived at Acre 6 weeks before Richard. He was sick, politically cautious, and had spent his 6 weeks making careful preparations and limited progress. Philip was brilliant at administration and formidable at political maneuvering. He was badly suited to this specific moment, which required not administration, but the kind of relentless, offensive pressure that Richard produced the way other men produced conversation. Within days of Richard's arrival, the siege changed character. He brought siege engines his engineers had been building in Sicily. He brought the organizational discipline of 15 years in Aquitaine. He brought the ability to be personally present at the most dangerous points of the assault without making it about his own glory, which is rarer than it sounds. He also brought a fever. Some combination of illness hit him within weeks of arrival. He directed part of the final stages of the siege from a litter, too sick to stand, but not sick enough to stop thinking clearly about what needed to happen. Acre surrendered on the 12th of July. 1191. The garrison had held for nearly 2 years. When they finally sent out their terms, they were reasonable. The garrison and their families would leave in exchange for the release of Christian prisoners held by Saladin, the return of the true cross, and a payment of 200,000 dinars. Richard agreed. Saladin agreed. The mechanics of actually executing the agreement proved more complicated than the agreement. The timeline ran into problems on both sides. Saladin was assembling the payment while managing the political pressures of his own coalition, which was not uniformly enthusiastic about the terms. On the Crusader side, the question of which prisoners were actually held and where was not as simple as the terms made it sound. Deadlines passed. Communication between the camps moved through intermediaries whose ability to convey nuance accurately was limited by language and the general atmosphere of mutual distrust that 2 years of siege warfare had produced. Richard grew impatient. On the 20th of August, 1191, he ordered the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners outside the walls of Acre. The exact number varies by source. The reasons given vary by source. What does not vary is the basic fact. Richard gave the order. His men carried it out. The military argument was real. An army that cannot feed prisoners cannot transport them on a march south. And Richard was about to begin a march south. Saladin had not met the agreed terms, which by the conventions of medieval warfare voided the agreement. These were not invented justifications. They were the actual calculations of a commander in the field. And they were not sufficient, because what happened outside Acre was not just a military decision. It was the moment where the idea of Richard and the reality of Richard occupied the same space most visibly. The Lionheart, the noble warrior, the crusading king, and the man who ordered 2,700 people killed after they had already surrendered. Both of those things were the same person, the same hands, the same voice giving the order. The question that the troubadour tradition and the chivalric ideal and the entire legend of the Lionheart were designed not to ask is what it means to celebrate one half of a man while treating the other half as a footnote. Saladin received the news from the hills above Acre. He did not react with volcanic fury. He processed the information with the cold intelligence of a man who understood what it told him about his opponent. Not that Richard was a monster, that Richard was capable of making the hard calculation in public, in full view of both armies. without visible hesitation. This was not a man who could be ground down by attrition. This was not a coalition that would fracture under sustained pressure. This was a man who had decided what he needed to do and had done it. And the fact that it was brutal did not appear to register as a significant variable in his decision-making. Saladin would need a different strategy. He withdrew to think. Richard broke camp and began moving south toward Jaffa. The army that followed him was not the collection of exhausted men that had been rotting on that beach for 2 years. It was a force that had been reorganized, resupplied, and given a clear demonstration of what their commander was willing to do. They followed him, not because they all agreed with what had happened at Acre. Some of the Crusader lords were visibly uncomfortable. They followed because he knew where he was going, and he was already moving. And in that army, on that march, in that heat, the alternative to moving was standing still. And standing still in that landscape meant dying of something before Saladin's cavalry reached you. They moved south along the coast. The sea on their right, the hills on their left. Saladin watching from the hills, Richard watching the hills from below. Both of them knew what was coming. The only question was, who would be ready when it arrived? The march from Acre to Jaffa was 80 miles. It took 3 weeks. This sounds slow until you understand what the march actually was. Not a movement from one place to another. A continuous battle conducted while moving. A test of organizational discipline so extreme that military historians have spent centuries studying it as one of the most technically demanding operations in medieval warfare. Saladin had made a decision after Acre. He could not stop Richard's army in a conventional engagement, not on ground of Richard's choosing, not with the Crusader infantry in their full defensive formation. So, he would not try to stop it. He would bleed it. His cavalry harassed the flanks of the Crusader column continuously. From first light until the army made camp, they rode close, loosed arrows, and withdrew before the Crusaders could mount an effective response. They targeted horses, which were irreplaceable. They found the gaps in discipline, the moments when heat and exhaustion made men sloppy, and they exploited those gaps. The goal was not to destroy the army in a single engagement. The goal was to destroy it one man at a time, every day, until the cumulative losses made it incapable of achieving anything. Richard understood this strategy. He had faced versions of it in Aquitaine. He had used versions of it himself. His counter was an act of collective will that bordered on the inhuman. The Crusader column marched in a formation specifically designed for this situation. Infantry formed a wall on the landward side, locked shields, and absorbed the cavalry charges without breaking, while crossbowmen returned fire in disciplined rotations. The cavalry moved inside this protective envelope, shielded from the worst of the harassment, preserved for the moment when they would be needed. The key was that no one broke formation to pursue. When a Hospitaller's horse went down beside him and the cavalry that had killed it was within striking range, the answer was no, not yet. When a knight watched the man next to him take an arrow and fall, and felt the specific fury that makes medieval cavalry want to charge, the answer was no, not yet. Richard rode up and down the column. The sources describe him doing this, moving between units, visible, present, in reach of the same arrows, landing around everyone else. He was not performing courage for an audience. He was doing the thing that only a commander with absolute authority over his own fear can do. He was showing the army, through the simple evidence of his body among theirs, that the situation was survivable day after day, in temperatures that the chronicles describe as almost unbearable, against an enemy that never stopped moving. The column held. Saladin watched from the hills and increased the pressure. He committed heavier cavalry. He pushed the harassment closer. He was looking for the break point, the moment when discipline gave way to the natural human response of striking back, regardless of cost. He found it on the 7th of September, 1191. In the forest, just south of the town of Arsuf, the Hospitallers broke. They had been taking casualties for days. Their horses were dying. Their rear guard was absorbing the worst of the pressure, and they had reached, collectively, the limit of what they were willing to absorb without responding. 2 of their senior knights charged without waiting for Richard's order. In most battles, this is the beginning of a disaster. An uncoordinated charge against an intact cavalry force, launched without preparation and without support, was exactly what Saladin had been trying to produce for 3 weeks. What happened instead is what makes Arsuf one of the most studied engagements of the crusading era. Richard saw the charge begin. He assessed the situation in what must have been a matter of seconds. The Hospitallers were committed. There was no pulling them back. The charge was happening, regardless of what he ordered. He ordered the charge, not just the Hospitallers, the entire cavalry, all at once. The full weight of the Crusader mounted force that had been held in reserve for 3 weeks. Committed at the exact moment when Saladin's cavalry was positioned to absorb a partial charge and destroy it, but was not positioned to absorb a full one. The timing was everything. The difference between a suicidal partial charge and a devastating full charge was the 2 seconds it took Richard to make a decision that could not be unmade. He made it correctly. Saladin's cavalry broke, not destroyed, not annihilated, but broken, forced off the field, unable to regroup before the Crusaders reached Arsuf and made camp on defensible ground. It was the most complete Crusader military victory since Jerusalem had fallen. Richard rode back through his army afterward with the particular quality of calm that very experienced soldiers develop after moments of extreme intensity. Not triumph, not relief. The mood of a man who had been somewhere very loud and has returned to a place where ordinary senses work again. His men were not quiet. The accounts describe cheering that could be heard at Saladin's position in the hills. Among the men in the Crusader army that day were soldiers who had been fighting in the Holy Land for years. Men who had survived Hattin in some cases. Men who had watched Jerusalem fall and spent 2 years in the camp at Acre watching disease and Muslim cavalry reduce their numbers week by week. They had followed a king they had known for 3 months, on a march designed to break them. And they had not broken. And when the break came, it was the other side that felt it. They understood what Richard had done. Not just the tactical decision at the moment of the charge. The 3 weeks before it, the discipline he had enforced, the presence he had maintained, the decision made and remade every single day. That the formation would hold and the moment would come. He had told them, without words, that he knew something they did not know yet, that the moment was coming. He had been right. On the hills above Arsuf, Saladin sat with his commanders. He was not broken. His army was intact. His strategic position was not fundamentally changed by one lost battle. He had recovered from defeats before, but he had learned something that he had not been certain of until now. The man on the other side of this war was not going to make the mistakes that previous Crusader commanders had made. He was not going to overextend in pursuit of a retreating enemy. He was not going to let the desire for glory override his logistics. He could not be provoked into the kind of emotional decision that Saladin's entire strategy was built around producing. Richard was going to keep coming. Saladin called his commanders together. He began thinking about Jerusalem, not about how to defend it if Richard attacked, about whether Richard attacking was actually the threat it appeared to be, or whether there was a gap between what Richard could achieve on a battlefield and what he could actually hold afterward. It was the right question. It was the same question Richard himself was going to spend the next year trying to answer. The army made camp at Arsuf. The wounded were treated. The dead were counted. The horses were fed and watered. Richard sat in his tent and thought about the 150 miles between him and the city he had crossed the world to reach. He had won the battle everyone had been waiting for. The hard part had not yet begun. Sometime in the autumn of 1191, a messenger crossed the lines between the Crusader army and Saladin's camp carrying a letter. This was not unusual. The two armies exchanged messages with a regularity that would have surprised anyone whose understanding of the Crusades came from the idea of two civilizations locked in total and irreconcilable holy war. The reality of warfare in the medieval Middle East was considerably more complicated. Truces were negotiated. Prisoners were ransomed. Information moved in both directions through intermediaries who understood that their value depended on both sides, finding them useful. What was unusual about the autumn of 1191 was the content of some of those messages. Richard sent his brother-in-law Humphrey of Tauron to meet with Saladin's brother Al-Adil. The meeting was ostensibly about a possible settlement. What it became, according to the sources that record it, was something considerably stranger. Richard proposed that his sister Joan should marry Al-Adil. The couple would jointly rule Jerusalem under some form of shared sovereignty. Christian pilgrims would have access to the holy sites. The arrangement would end the war without either side having to admit defeat. Al-Adil brought this to Saladin. Saladin said it was an excellent idea. Joan's response, when Richard told her, was immediate and absolute. She refused. She was not going to marry a Muslim. She did not care about the strategic logic. The proposal collapsed. Whether Richard was entirely serious about it or whether he was probing the limits of what Saladin was willing to consider, historians have argued about ever since. The answer is probably that he was doing both at once, genuinely exploring whether a deal was possible while gathering information about where Saladin's constraints actually lay. What the proposal reveals, whatever its purpose, is that Richard's understanding of this war was more sophisticated than the image of a warrior king simply charging toward Jerusalem suggests. He had come with religious commitment that was real. He had also come with the pragmatic intelligence of a man who had spent his adult life solving political problems. And he understood that the question of how to hold Jerusalem after taking it was as serious as the question of how to take it. He was looking for a solution. He did not find one, because the gap between Richard and Saladin was not, in the end, primarily military. Saladin had spent 20 years building the political coalition that had unified the Muslim world and taken Jerusalem. He had made promises to the caliphs and the emirs and the ordinary people who had followed him through those 20 years. Jerusalem was not just a position he could trade away in exchange for peace. It was the thing that justified everything he had ever done and everything he had ever asked of anyone who had followed him. He could not give it up without destroying the entire structure his career had built. Richard had made promises too. He had taken the cross before witnesses. He had raised money and built ships and led an army across the Mediterranean on the explicit commitment that he was going to recover what had been lost. The Christian world was watching. The Pope was watching. The troubadours who would turn this campaign into song were watching. He could not go home without Jerusalem, without destroying the thing that justified the crusade and his role in it. 2 men. 2 sets of promises. 1 city. The city was not going to move. Al-Adil became, over those months, something like a back channel between the 2 sides. Richard liked Al-Adil personally, which is not surprising. Al-Adil was intelligent, direct, and had the quality that Richard always responded to in people regardless of which side they were on. He meant what he said. Through Al-Adil, Richard developed a picture of Saladin that was more complete than anything battlefield intelligence could provide. He learned that Saladin was exhausted, that the campaign had been longer and more draining than Saladin had anticipated, that the Muslim coalition, like the Crusader coalition, was held together partly by genuine shared commitment and partly by the specific personality of the man at its center. And that personality was under considerable strain. He also learned that Saladin was not going to give him Jerusalem, not because he could not be beaten militarily. Arsuf had demonstrated that he could be, because Jerusalem was not, for Saladin, primarily a military question. Richard sat with this understanding through the cold months of 1191 and into 1192 and turned it over in his mind. He had come to take Jerusalem. He understood now that taking Jerusalem was not the same thing as holding Jerusalem. An army that captured a city and could not supply it, could not staff its defenses, could not maintain the lines of communication back to the coast, was not an army that had achieved anything durable. It was an army that had spent itself to take a position it could not keep. The Templars and Hospitallers, the military orders with more experience of maintaining positions in this landscape than anyone else in the Crusader army, confirmed what Richard's own assessment was telling him. They could take Jerusalem. They could not hold it. He kept this analysis to himself. He kept it to himself because the army that had marched from Acre to Arsuf to Jaffa had done it for Jerusalem. The men who had held their formation in the heat while arrows killed their horses. The infantry who had walked into bowshot every morning for 3 weeks without breaking. They had done all of it because Jerusalem was at the end of the road. Telling them that Jerusalem was at the end of the road, but they were not going to walk the last 12 miles, was not a conversation he was ready to have. He continued moving toward the city. He continued the negotiations through Al-Adil, and through all of it, the messages kept crossing between the camps. There is a quality to the relationship between Richard and Saladin, even filtered through 9 centuries of interpretation, and the inevitable distortions of sources written by partisans on both sides. That is genuinely unusual in the history of medieval warfare. They respected each other, not in the sentimental way that later legend would construct. The noble enemies who were secretly friends. The warriors who transcended the conflict that divided them. The reality was more specific and less romantic than that. They respected each other's competence. Each of them understood that the man across from him was operating at the same level of seriousness that he himself was operating at. There was no condescension in either direction, no assumption that the enemy's perspective was simply wrong or beneath serious consideration. This mutual respect did not change anything about the fundamental incompatibility of their positions. It just meant that they both understood the situation clearly. 2 intelligent men, 2 impossible sets of promises, 1 city that was not going to be shared. The negotiation through Al-Adil continued. Jerusalem did not move, and, in England, Eleanor was managing the kingdom that was paying for all of it, reading the dispatches that arrived weeks after the events they described, building a picture of her son's situation from fragments, and understanding, with the clarity she brought to everything, that the crusade was moving toward a resolution that was not going to look like a victory. She did not stop managing England. There was always more of England to manage. January of 1192. A ridge in the hills of Judea. Somewhere between Beit Nuba and the horizon, Richard rode to the crest of the ridge. From there, on a clear day, you could see Jerusalem, not close, not the way you see a city when you are walking its streets, more the way you see a storm coming across open plains, a distant presence, a shape against the sky that changes the quality of everything around it simply by being there. He looked at it. One of the chronicles from this period records that Richard raised his shield in front of his face at this moment, that he refused to look directly at the city because he had sworn he would not look at Jerusalem until he was ready to take it. And he was not ready. Whether this happened exactly as described, whether the gesture was as deliberate and symbolic as the chronicle makes it sound, cannot be verified. What can be verified is what happened next. He called a council. The council included the masters of the temple and the hospital, the senior lords of the Crusader states, and the principal commanders of the various contingents that made up his army. He laid out the military situation with the directness that characterized his command style when he needed people to understand something they did not want to understand. The army before them had enough men and enough strength to assault Jerusalem. It did not have enough men and enough strength to hold Jerusalem after taking it. The city sat in the Judean hills, surrounded by terrain that Saladin could use to cut supply lines from the coast. Every day, the Crusader army spent inside Jerusalem, away from its ships and its supply bases, was a day Saladin could use to tighten the ring. Taking the city would be the easy part. Holding it would destroy them. The council agreed. They turned back. Now hold that decision for a moment before moving past it. These were men who had left their homes, sold their lands, in some cases, crossed a sea, marched through heat and disease, watched their companions die of wounds and illness and thirst, held their formation while cavalry rode into them day after day for 3 weeks. They had done all of this for one reason. They turned around 12 miles from that reason. The chronicles describe the army's reaction with a restraint that probably understates what actually happened in that camp. There was weeping. There was rage. Men who had been holding themselves together through months of campaign by telling themselves that Jerusalem was at the end of the road, discovered that Jerusalem was not the end of the road. And the thing that had been holding them together went out of them, like air going out of a room. Richard rode through the camp that afternoon. He did not give a speech. There is no record of him addressing the army formally on the day of the retreat from Beit Nuba. He rode her. He was seen. He was present in the specific way. He was always present in moments of difficulty, which was physically, visibly, in the same air as the people he was asking to carry something very heavy. It was not enough to make the decision feel good. It was enough, barely, to make the army function. Eleanor was in England when the word reached her. She had been receiving letters throughout the campaign, dispatches filtered through intermediaries, accounts of Acre and Arsuf and the negotiations with Saladin. She had been building a picture of her son's situation from these fragments with the methodical attention she brought to everything. The letter that told her Richard had turned back from Jerusalem told her something else she had perhaps been waiting to know since he left England 3 years earlier. He was not coming home soon, not because he had failed in the simple sense. The retreat from Beit Nuba was not failure. Richard had made the correct decision for the army and for the long-term position of the Crusader states. He had not sacrificed his force in pursuit of a symbol, but it meant the campaign was not over. And the campaign not being over meant more time, more money, more management of a kingdom whose king was somewhere in the Judean hills, making decisions that the people paying for those decisions would never be consulted about. She went back to managing England. She was always going back to managing England. Richard moved the army back toward the coast and began the work of keeping it operational through the weeks that followed the retreat. Supplies, training, the management of the increasingly strained relationships between the various contingents, the problem of Conrad of Montferrat, who had been maneuvering for the kingship of Jerusalem, and whose political position Richard needed to handle without either alienating him or rewarding him prematurely. Conrad was assassinated in April of 1192 by members of the Assassins sect. Whether Richard had any connection to this has been disputed since the day it happened. Most historians consider it unlikely. What is not disputed is that Richard responded quickly, supporting the elevation of Henry of Champagne to lead the remaining Crusader forces in a way that stabilized the political situation and allowed the campaign to continue. The campaign continued toward a second approach to Jerusalem. In June of 1192, the army was again at Beit Nuba. Again, Richard called his council. Again, the analysis was the same. They could take the city. They could not hold it. The retreat was the right decision. Again, they turned back. This time, there is a story that one of Richard's companions led him to a vantage point without telling him where they were going. And when Richard realized he could see Jerusalem, he turned away and covered his eyes with his cloak. Some accounts say he spoke words to the effect that he was not worthy to look at what he had been unable to deliver. Whether this happened exactly as described, whether it was a spontaneous reaction or a calculated gesture or something that grew in the telling over years, cannot be known. What can be known is what it communicates. Here was a man who understood exactly what he was doing and exactly what it cost. He was not a person who made hard decisions and filed them away without remainder. The decision not to attack Jerusalem lived in him. The full weight of it, what it meant for the men who had followed him, what it meant for the symbol that had organized the entire enterprise, what it meant for his own understanding of what his life was for, settled on him on that ridge in June with the specific heaviness of something that is not going to get lighter. He turned back. The army moved toward Jaffa. Saladin, watching from Jerusalem, saw the Crusader force retreating for the second time from a position they had been strong enough to attack, and understood something he had not been certain of until now. The man who had beaten him at Arsuf, who had organized the most disciplined Crusader march he had ever witnessed, who had taken Acre and fortified Ascalon and outmaneuvered his cavalry at every engagement, was not going to take Jerusalem, not because he lacked the courage, because he was honest enough to understand that taking it and holding it were different things, and he was not willing to spend his army on the first if it meant losing the second. Saladin felt, for the first time in the campaign, something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. He and Richard were, in this specific and painful way, alike. Both of them were trapped by the same city. Both of them understood, better than anyone else on either side, exactly how trapped they were. On the last day of July, 1192, Richard received word that Jaffa had fallen. He was in Acre when it arrived. Saladin's forces had taken the city in a matter of days. The garrison was holding the citadel, but could not hold it much longer. If Jaffa fell completely, the Crusader position on the coast collapsed. Everything Richard had built since Acre, every mile of the march south, every battle, Every fortification, every negotiation came apart. He got on a ship. He did not wait to organize a proper relief force. He did not send scouts to assess the situation before committing. He loaded what men he could onto the galleys available and sailed south. And when he arrived off Jaffa the following morning and saw that the citadel was still flying a Christian banner, he did not wait for the ships to find a safe landing. He jumped into the water. The sea was chest deep where he went in. He was wearing armor. He waded toward shore under fire from Saladin's forces, who had not yet consolidated control of the beach. And behind him, the men on the ship saw their king in the water and followed him. Because in that army, in that moment, there was no version of themselves that could have stayed on the ship. They took the beach. They held Jaffa. This moment was recorded by chroniclers on both sides with the specific quality of attention that people give to things they cannot quite believe they are seeing. The Muslim sources that describe it do not describe it with contempt. They describe it with the vocabulary that military cultures reserve for acts of personal courage that exceed what the situation requires. 3 days later, Saladin launched a dawn assault on the Crusader position, designed to overwhelm it before it could be properly organized. Richard had somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men. Saladin sent several times that number. Richard fought on foot, personally, moving along the line of his infantry, making his presence felt in the places where presence mattered most. The Crusader force, drastically outnumbered, held its formation. The cavalry charges broke against the infantry line. The assault failed at some point during or after the battle, according to sources of varying reliability. Saladin sent 2 horses to Richard. The gesture has been interpreted many ways over the centuries: as chivalric respect, as a psychological move, as evidence of a relationship between the 2 commanders that transcended the conflict itself. The story may be embellished. It may be accurate. It was told by people who were there, or claimed to be there, and it was told specifically about these 2 men, which means it was capturing something that felt true to the people telling it, even if the precise details shifted in the telling. Something real was being described. By August of 1192, both sides had run out of what they needed to keep going. Richard's army was shrinking. Disease had returned with the summer heat. The English lords wanted to go home. The French contingent had been difficult for months. Richard himself was sick again. The same fever that had come and gone throughout the campaign. And the news from England was consistently troubling. Philip of France was pressing on Richard's French territories, and John was not managing the situation in ways that suggested he should be trusted to manage anything. Saladin's situation was not better. His army had been in the field for years. His emirs were restless. The coalition that had held together through the taking of Jerusalem and the campaigns against the Crusaders was showing the strain of sustained operation against a smaller force that should have been defeated by attrition and was still standing on the beach at Jaffa. They needed to stop. Both of them knew it. The negotiations that produced the Treaty of Jaffa in September of 1192 were conducted through Al-Adil and various intermediaries over several careful weeks. Richard conducted part of them from a sickbed. Saladin conducted them while managing the continuing military situation and the political pressures of his own coalition. The terms they reached were not what either man had come to the Holy Land to achieve. The Crusaders kept the coastal strip from Jaffa to Acre. Christian pilgrims would be permitted to visit Jerusalem unarmed. The truce would last 3 years. Ascalon, which Richard had spent weeks rebuilding and fortifying, was to be dismantled. Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands. When Richard's advisers brought him the final terms for approval, he was in bed. He read them. He approved them. He did not say much about it. What was there to say? He had won every battle. He had organized the most effective Crusader military campaign since the First Crusade. He had taken Acre, won at Arsuf, held Jaffa twice, and demonstrated on every field where they had met directly that Saladin's army could not defeat him in open engagement, and Jerusalem was still in Muslim hands. After the treaty was signed, Saladin extended an invitation through intermediaries. Richard could come to Jerusalem as a pilgrim. He could see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He could fulfill the spiritual purpose of the crusade, even if he could not fulfill its military objective. Richard refused. He would go to Jerusalem as a conqueror, or he would not go at all. To enter the city as a pilgrim, under terms he had agreed to and Saladin had granted, was to acknowledge in public what he was not prepared to acknowledge in public. He had come to take the city. He had not taken the city. Whatever else was true, that was true, and he was not going to dress it in pilgrim's robes and pretend it was something else. He got on a ship in early October of 1192. The coast of the Holy Land disappeared behind him. In the camp, in the days between the signing of the treaty and the departure, some of the men who had held their formation on the march from Acre went to Jerusalem as pilgrims, taking advantage of the access the treaty had secured. They walked through streets where Christian churches still stood, where the holy sites remained intact under Saladin's rule, where everything was physically still what it had always been, except it was not theirs. The gap between what the city was and what the crusade had promised it would become was not geographic. It was not architectural. It was not something you could see by looking at the walls or the streets or the churches. It was everything. Richard stood at Jaffa and looked toward the hills that hid Jerusalem from the coast. He said, according to one account, that he prayed God would permit him to come back and win what he had not been able to win this time. Whether he believed there would be a next time, the sources do not say. He got on the ship. The coast went away behind him. Saladin stood in Jerusalem and watched the Crusader fleet disappear over the horizon. He had held the city. He had stopped Richard at the only place Richard could be stopped, which was not on a battlefield, but at the 12 miles between Beit Nuba and the walls. 6 months after the Treaty of Jaffa, Saladin was dead. He died in March of 1193. In Damascus, of a fever. He had given away most of his personal wealth over the course of his life and died with almost nothing. His treasury held enough to cover his burial expenses and almost nothing more. He was 55 years old. He had held Jerusalem. He had never met Richard face to face. He was buried in Damascus, in a mausoleum that still stands. His tomb draws visitors from around the world, people who come to see the man who stopped the Lionheart, who understand, when they stand in that room, that the story of the Third Crusade was not a story about one side winning and one side losing. It was a story about two men who were both trying to hold something that neither of them could afford to surrender, and the city that neither of them could surrender still stands between them. In history and in memory, exactly where it has always stood. Exactly 12 miles from the ridge where Richard raised his shield against a sight he had not yet earned the right to see. The ship went down in the Adriatic in December of 1192, not catastrophically, not with the drama of a great maritime disaster. It ran into weather somewhere on the coast that is now Croatia, and Richard and a small group of companions made it to shore, wet and cold, and approximately 1,000 miles from England. Between him and England lay the territories of several European rulers who had specific and personal reasons to want Richard in a position of vulnerability. Philip of France, who had been at Acre, who had watched Richard operate, who had gone home early and spent the months since actively working to dismantle Richard's French territories. Leopold of Austria, whose flag Richard had ordered torn down from the walls of Acre after the city fell, a humiliation that Leopold had not forgotten. Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, who had his own political reasons for finding Richard's current situation useful. Richard was travelling incognito. He was not good at it. The King of England was one of the most recognisable men in Europe. He was tall, red-haired, physically distinctive, in ways that could not be hidden by changing his clothes. He had been on crusade for 2 years, and his face had been seen by thousands of soldiers on two sides of a conflict that half of Europe had been following as closely as anything happening in their own countries. Travelling quietly through Central Europe as an ordinary merchant required a talent for invisibility that Richard had never needed to develop and did not possess. He was recognized near Vienna in December of 1192 by agents working for Duke Leopold of Austria. The arrest was made without ceremony. Leopold, understanding what he had, moved quickly to transfer his prize to the custody of Emperor Henry VI before anyone with competing claims could complicate the situation. The ransom demand that followed was 150,000 marks of silver. England's total annual royal revenue at this time was somewhere around £75,000. The ransom was asking England to pay, in a single transaction, roughly twice what the Crown collected in a year from every source combined. It was not a figure designed to be paid quickly. It was a figure designed to make the kingdom that paid it feel the payment for years. Eleanor received the news of Richard's capture in early 1193. She was 71 years old. She sat with the news long enough to understand it fully. Then she went to work. What Eleanor did over the following 14 months to secure Richard's release is one of the most remarkable performances in the medieval record. And it is remarkable in part because it is almost entirely missing from the popular story of Richard the Lionheart. Everyone knows Richard went on the crusade. Almost no one talks about who brought him home. She wrote to Pope Celestine III. The letter that survives is not a supplication, it is a remonstrance. She reminded the Pope that Richard was a crusading king returning from the service of the Church, that his imprisonment by a Christian ruler violated the protections the Church had explicitly extended to crusaders, and that the Pope's measured and diplomatic response to this situation was not sufficient to the gravity of what was happening. She wrote again when the first letter produced inadequate results. She organized the collection of the ransom. This was not a matter of opening a treasury and counting silver. It required a special tax across England and the English holdings in France. It required the collection of plate from churches. It required the cooperation of barons and clergy who were being asked to pay for a king's misfortune. And that cooperation was not guaranteed, because John was actively working to prevent the ransom from being assembled. John had made his calculations. A Richard who remained in prison was a Richard who was not coming back to deal with what John had been doing in his absence. He sent representatives to Germany with the argument that Richard was not coming home and that the emperor should consider the political and financial advantages of keeping things as they were. Eleanor dealt with John. The sources do not record in detail how she dealt with him, which probably means she did it the way she did most things, that required subtlety, through private conversation rather than public confrontation, through the combination of family authority and political realism that she had been deploying against difficult men for 50 years. John stopped obstructing the collection. The ransom fund grew. She also negotiated the terms of Richard's release with Henry VI directly. She travelled to Germany herself with the collected silver, because she did not trust intermediaries with something this important, and because at 71 years old, she had not developed the habit of delegating things that mattered. Think about what this actually was. Richard was the warrior. He had crossed the Mediterranean, fought Saladin, held Jaffa while outnumbered several times over. He had done all of this with a sword and the absolute certainty of his own physical capacity. Eleanor was in her 70s, traveling across Europe in winter, writing letters to popes, managing a recalcitrant son, organizing the largest single financial transaction in the history of the English crown, doing all of it without an army and without the kind of authority that anyone had formally given her. She was doing it anyway. The story of the crusade belongs to Richard. The story of the ransom belongs to Eleanor. She presented herself at the emperor's court. She presented the first installment of the ransom. She received her son. Richard was released on the 4th of February, 1194. Eleanor was there when he came out. What they said to each other, standing in a German courtyard with the silver of England between them and the road home ahead of them. No chronicle records. We know the shape of what had happened. She had crossed half of Europe. At 71, in winter, to bring him home from a prison he had walked into because he could not travel quietly through Austria without being recognized. She had organized the money, written the letters, made the journey, and stood in the room to make sure the exchange happened as agreed. She had done all of this for a son who had sailed away from England at the first opportunity and had now cost his kingdom more than it earned in 2 years to retrieve him. She had done it without apparent hesitation. This is either the most complete expression of maternal devotion in the medieval record, or it is the action of a woman who had invested so much of herself in what Richard represented that she could not afford to let the investment fail, or it is both of those things simultaneously. Which is the most honest answer? She had made him. She was not going to let him disappear into a German prison while she still had the capacity to prevent it. The road back to England ran through a Europe that had been reorganized in Richard's absence. Philip of France had taken territory in Normandy and Anjou. John had cooperated with Philip in ways that would require addressing. The political situation in England and in the Angevin lands in France needed attention that had been unavailable while the kingdom's king was in a cage. Richard assessed the situation with the speed he brought to military assessments. He had a war to fight. He was almost glad of it. Eleanor watched her son come back to life in the way she had always watched him, with the full attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at, a man who was most completely himself when there was something in front of him that needed to be defeated. He had been in a cage for 14 months. She had come to the door and opened it. He walked out, looking for the next war. She was not sure whether to be proud or frightened. She had been not sure about that for 30 years. Richard landed in England on the 13th of March, 1194. He had been gone 4 years and 3 months. The country that came out to watch him ride from the coast toward London did not entirely know what it was looking at. The stories had been travelling for years, accumulating the way stories do when the person at their centre is far away and the only information arriving comes in fragments. Acre, Arsuf, the march in the heat, the wall outside Jerusalem, the treaty, the prison, the ransom. Each piece had arrived separately, filtered through whatever intermediaries were available, shaped by the agendas of whoever was doing the telling. The man riding through the English countryside in March of 1194 did not look like a man who had been through all of that. He looked, by accounts, more or less as he had looked when he left, still tall, still physically imposing in a way that did not diminish with captivity, still possessed of the quality that rooms and crowds responded to. The crowds were large. The welcome was genuine. Richard received it with the ease of a man who had been receiving public attention his entire life. Eleanor travelled with him. She had come to Germany to bring him out of captivity, and she stayed at his side for the English return, which was partly a matter of maternal presence and partly a matter of political communication. Her being there said something specific to the barons and clergy who came out to swear renewed loyalty to the returning king. It said that the woman who had organized the ransom, who had held the country together in his absence, was satisfied with what was happening. It said that Eleanor endorsed what she was standing next to. This was not nothing. Her endorsement had been worth something real for 50 years. The first significant business was John. John had spent Richard's imprisonment doing what John always did when the restraining force of Richard's presence was removed, looking for opportunities and taking the ones that seemed to offer more gain than risk. He had been in communication with Philip of France. He had made arrangements that a returning king would need to address. When Richard came back, John came to him. The meeting was private. What was said between them is not recorded. What is recorded is the outcome. Richard forgave him. He said, according to the most frequently cited account, that he hoped he would forget John's offences as easily as John would forget his pardon. This line has been quoted for 900 years as evidence of Richard's magnanimity, or his cynicism, or his understanding that holding a grudge required time and energy he did not have. The most honest reading is probably the simplest one. Richard did not have time for a prolonged reckoning with John. Philip of France was in his French territories. The political situation in Normandy and Anjou required his attention immediately. John was manageable. John was also family, in the specific way that Plantagenet family worked, which meant someone you dealt with on the basis of what he could do for you and against you going forward, not on the basis of what he had done while you were away. The past was not interesting to Richard. The problem in front of him was interesting. He held a second coronation in April of 1194, a formal reaffirmation of royal authority after the interruption of captivity. Its purpose was to mark a transition, not to introduce an unknown quantity. Everyone in the room already knew who Richard was. He spent the following weeks on the administrative backlog that had accumulated in his absence, hearing cases, making appointments, signing documents, managing the particular kind of work that accumulates when a government has been operating without its head for over a year. He was not good at this work in the sustained way it required. He was not interested in it the way its performance demanded. He did what needed to be done, but he did it with the quality of attention of a man whose mind was elsewhere, organizing the next campaign while his hands signed documents in front of him. He was already thinking about France. Philip had used Richard's imprisonment with the systematic efficiency that characterized everything Philip did. He had taken territory in Normandy and Anjou. He had built alliances with local lords whose loyalties had been uncertain. He had done to the Angevin Empire in France what a capable and patient adversary does when given 14 months of uncontested access. He had made himself difficult to remove. Richard was going to remove him anyway. In May of 1194, 4 months after landing in England, Richard left for Normandy. He would not come back. Eleanor was at the docks. She had been at many docks over the years. Watching people, she loved board ships for destinations that carried various degrees of danger. She was 72 years old. She understood the arithmetic of departure at her age with a clarity that younger people could not fully access. She knew the specific quality of this particular departure. Richard turned back once. At the gangway, one account records that he looked at Eleanor with an expression that the witness found difficult to describe. something between apology and recognition. The look of a person who understands something about a situation that cannot be changed and cannot quite be said aloud. He went aboard. The ship moved out. Eleanor stood at the dock and watched it go. She had been watching him his entire life. She had watched him become what she made him. She had watched the making cost both of them in ways she had not fully anticipated when she began it. She had watched him take an army across the Mediterranean and bring it back without Jerusalem. She had watched him come out of a German prison, still looking for the next war. She was watching him leave England for the last time. She knew it was the last time, not because she had information that confirmed it, because she was 72 years old and had watched enough last times to recognize them by their texture. He did not look back again after that first turn at the gangway. He was already thinking about Normandy. The ship disappeared. Eleanor went back to work. Richard spent the last 5 years of his life in France, fighting Philip for the territories Philip had taken and the territories Philip wanted, and the ongoing question of which of the two of them was going to be the dominant power in Western Europe. He built a castle in Normandy called Château Gaillard that military engineers still study as an example of innovative defensive design. Everything Richard had learned about sieges in Aquitaine and Cyprus and Acre translated into stone, built to resist exactly the kind of attack that Richard himself would have mounted against it. He won engagement. He rebuilt the Angevin position in France substantially. He was against Philip, the same commander he had been against Saladin. The difference was that this war had no Jerusalem at the end of it, no single objective that organized the effort and gave it meaning beyond the grinding recovery of territory. No city on a ridge 12 miles away that you could see on a clear day, and that made every step toward it feel like it mattered. This was the kind of war his father had fought for 30 years. The ongoing, never quite finished management of a border that was always being contested and never quite secured. Richard fought it with full competence, and without the quality of complete commitment that he had brought to the crusade. He continued. Eleanor moved between England and her Aquitanian territories, managing the ongoing administration of the Plantagenet holdings with the energy that she seemed constitutionally unable to relinquish. She was in her 70s. People occasionally suggested she should rest. She did not rest. She was watching a border she could not see from where she stood, managing a country whose king was in France, waiting for news that she understood, with the specific knowledge of a woman who had been paying attention for 70 years, would eventually be bad. The news arrived in April of 1199. She received it the way she received everything by that point in her life. She sat with it. She understood it. She made the arrangements that needed to be made. She began the journey to Châlus. The castle of Châlus was not worth dying for. This was not a retrospective judgment made with the benefit of knowing what happened there. It was the assessment of experienced military men at the time, men who had seen enough sieges to understand the difference between an objective with genuine strategic value and one that existed because a chain of political obligation had produced a military requirement that nobody had fully thought through. The dispute that brought Richard to Châlus in March of 1199 was about treasure. A peasant on land belonging to the Viscount of Limoges had reportedly found a hoard of gold figures or coins. The sources disagree about the specifics. The Viscount claimed it. Richard claimed that treasure found in a vassal's territory belonged to the overlord, which meant it belonged to him. The Viscount did not comply. Richard came with an army, not a large army, a professional force adequate to reduce a modest fortification efficiently, the kind of operation that someone with Richard's experience could manage quickly and conclude without particular drama. The garrison of Châlus numbered perhaps 40 men. The castle was not a major fortification. It lacked the defensive depth of the places Richard had reduced in Aquitaine in his early career, let alone anything he had encountered in the Holy Land. It was the kind of problem Richard solved before breakfast. The siege began. The engineers made progress. The outcome was not in question. On the evening of the 26th of March, Richard walked out to observe the work without putting on his full armor. He was carrying a shield. He was not wearing a hauberk, the chain-mail coat that would have provided meaningful protection against a missile. It was the kind of decision a man makes hundreds of times in a military career without consequence, because the situation does not seem to require the full weight of preparation. The castle was small. The garrison was nearly finished. There was no particular reason to think tonight was different from the last 10 nights. On the wall, a young soldier was doing something that caught Richard's eye. He was holding a frying pan in one hand and a crossbow in the other, using the pan as a shield. Some accounts say he had been doing this throughout the siege, improvising where the garrison lacked proper equipment. One source says Richard laughed when he saw him. There is something about the image. One man with a cooking pan, standing against the army of the most dangerous king in Europe, that fits exactly the kind of stubborn, outmatched courage that Richard had always been drawn to. On his own side and on the other, he raised his shield in what some accounts describe as a gesture of acknowledgement. Then the bolt hit. It caught him in the left shoulder, near the base of the neck, in the gap between the shield and his body that the angle of the shot found with the randomness that defines the difference between wounds and death in combat. Not aimed with precision, not the result of exceptional skill. A bolt fired from a wall at a figure below, finding by chance the specific geometry that made it dangerous. Richard walked back to his tent. He tried to remove the bolt himself in the dark and made the wound worse. A surgeon finished the extraction, clumsily, breaking the bolt and leaving fragments that should not have been left. The wound turned. Gangrene spread from the shoulder into the surrounding tissue and then into the blood. Richard understood within days that he was dying. He handled this information with the quality that all the sources, hostile and sympathetic alike, attribute to him at this moment. He was not afraid of it, not performing courage for an audience, not making a show of equanimity for the chroniclers who were already taking notes. He was, by every account, simply a man who had organized his entire life around the acceptance of physical risk and who encountered the final consequence of that organization with the same steadiness he had brought to the march from Acre. He sent for the man who had fired the bolt. The young soldier was brought to him, expecting execution, because the execution of the person responsible for a king's mortal wound was well within the range of things that medieval justice permitted and medieval practice endorsed. Some later accounts give him the name Bertrand de Gourdon. Others leave him almost nameless. In either case, history remembers him less as a man than as the arrow. Richard looked at him. He asked why he had shot. The young man said, according to the account that has come down through various versions, that Richard had killed his father and his 2 brothers, and that he had fired for vengeance, and that whatever Richard did to him now, he had no regrets. Richard looked at him for a moment. He told him he was pardoned. He told his attendants to give the young man money and release him. Then he turned back to dying. Whether this exchange happened exactly as described, no source can fully confirm. What is consistent across the sources is that Richard made the decision to pardon whoever had fired the bolt, and that the decision was genuine, and that it was communicated while Richard was still capable of making and communicating decisions. What happened after Richard died is also consistent across sources. His attendants killed the young man despite the pardon. Richard had forgiven him. The culture Richard had spent 20 years building through force and fear, and the language of absolute consequence, did not have the capacity to honor what he had said. He could make the gesture. What he had created around himself could not sustain it. Eleanor arrived at Châlus before he died. She had been at Fontevraud Abbey, in the region. When the news of the wound reached her, she travelled immediately. She was 77 years old, and the roads in March were not good, and none of that was relevant to her decision. She had always travelled when Richard needed her. This was the last time he was going to need her. She arrived in time. What passed between them in the tent at Châlus in the last days of March and the first days of April? 1199. The people who were present understood was not theirs to record. They were witnessing a mother and her son at the end of the story that had defined both of them. Whatever was said is gone. Richard died on the 6th of April. 1199. He was 41 years old. He had been King of England for 9 years and 8 months. He had spent less than 6 months of that reign in England. His heart was removed and buried at Rouen, in Normandy. Among the people he had considered his own. In a way he had never quite considered the English his own. His body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in France. At the feet of his father, Henry II, the man he had spent half his life fighting and whose most essential qualities he had inherited without ever fully acknowledging it. His entrails were buried at Châlus. He was divided in death, as he had been in life. Pieces of him distributed across the territories he had fought for, and governed, and abandoned, and fought for again. Nothing left for the island kingdom that would spend the next 900 years calling him its greatest medieval hero. Outside the tent at Châlus, the siege continued. The castle fell 2 days after Richard died. It fell after his death had made its fall entirely pointless. The castle that killed Richard the Lionheart was taken at a cost that had no military or political value whatsoever. The treasure that started the dispute was never definitively identified or confirmed to have existed in the way the original claim described. Eleanor sat beside her son's tomb at Fontevraud for a long time before she left. The length of time she sat there is not recorded. Some things are not recorded because no one thought to write them down. Some things are not recorded because the people who were there understood that what they were witnessing belonged to the person experiencing it and not to the history that would come after. Eleanor of Aquitaine sat beside her son's tomb for as long as she needed to. Then she got up. Then she went back to work. There is a bronze statue outside the Houses of Parliament in London. It was cast in 1860, during the reign of Queen Victoria, at a moment when the British Empire covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's surface, and the people running that empire were engaged in the ongoing project of deciding what kind of history justified what kind of power. The statue shows a man on horseback, sword raised toward the sky, head turned slightly as if scanning a horizon for the next thing that needs to be defeated. The inscription identifies him as Richard I of England. He is pointing east, toward Jerusalem. The people who commissioned that statue in 1860 knew their history. They knew Richard had spent less than 6 months in England during a 10-year reign. They knew he had taxed the country to the edge of its capacity to fund a war in the Middle East. They knew the crusade had not taken Jerusalem. They knew he had died in France, in a minor dispute over treasure, and been buried in a French abbey at the feet of a father he had spent half his life fighting. They put him on a horse outside Parliament anyway, because in 1860 the British Empire needed a Richard who pointed toward Jerusalem. It needed the image of a warrior king who organized the full resources of his civilization toward a higher purpose and led that civilization personally into the field. It needed the idea that English power had always been animated by something more than the ordinary calculations of money and territory. Richard gave them that image. He had been giving it to people for 700 years by then. Every era that has engaged with Richard the Lionheart has found in him the thing that era needed to find. The medieval church found a crusader king who died in service to Christendom. The Romantics found a tragic hero, magnificent and doomed. The Victorians found an imperial ancestor, the first of the great English commanders who carried European civilization into other people's territories. Each century looked at the same man and saw its own reflection, dressed in 12th century armor. What the 21st century has the tools to find, if it chooses to look, is something different. It finds the bill, the 150,000 marks of silver that England paid to retrieve Richard from a German prison was collected from people who had already paid the Saladin tithe to fund the crusade. They paid twice, once to send him to Jerusalem and once to bring him back from Austria. They paid with actual silver, melted from actual objects, taken from actual households and actual churches. And the payment left actual gaps in actual lives that the chronicles of the crusade did not record, because the chronicles were travelling with Richard, not staying behind in Yorkshire. The farmer in Yorkshire who paid the Saladin tithe in 1190 does not have a statue outside Parliament. He does not have a chronicle. He does not have a name in any surviving record. He has descendants. Probably a substantial number of people alive today are descended from people who paid for Richard's legend with money they could not easily afford and received nothing in return except the ongoing project of living in a country whose king had decided their country was primarily useful as a source of funds for something happening very far away. Eleanor understood this dimension of Richard's reign better than any other person of her time. She was the one who managed England in his absences, who heard the petitions and managed the grievances and held together an administration that was perpetually operating without the person who was supposed to be at its centre. She did not publicly criticize him for it. She was his mother. She had made him what he was. She understood, with the honesty that she brought to everything, that you cannot build something and then disclaim the building when the consequences arrive. She had given him the idea that a great man was defined by what he did, not by where he stayed. She could not unmake that idea now. So she did what she had always done. She stayed. She was present where he was absent. She did the work that his absence made necessary. She was the fixed point around which his perpetual motion organized itself. This is not a role that gets a bronze horse. It is the role that made the bronze horse possible. Richard could not have been the Lionheart without Eleanor being Eleanor. Without someone managing England while he taxed it and left it. Without someone organizing the ransom while he sat in a German prison. Without someone arriving at Châlus when the bolt found the gap in his armor and sitting beside him while the infection did what infections did in 1199. The legend of Richard the Lionheart is a story about one person that required two people to produce. One of them got the bronze horse outside Parliament. The other one got a tomb at Fontevraud where she is depicted, in the effigy that has survived 8 centuries, with a book open in her hands. She was always reading. She was always paying attention. She was always doing the work that made the legend possible, while the legend was somewhere else being made. Eleanor died in April of 1204. She was somewhere between 80 and 82 years old. She had outlived her husband, most of her children, and nearly everyone she had known at the height of her power. She had governed Aquitaine, run England as regent, organized the largest ransom in English history, and watched the son she had built into a legend die in a tent outside a castle nobody remembers. She was buried at Fontevraud, beside Henry II, the man who had imprisoned her for 16 years. The tomb effigy shows her reading. It is the most honest monument in this entire story. Stand outside the Houses of Parliament in London on any given morning and watch the tourists photograph the statue. They frame Richard from below, pointing the camera up at the sword, the horse, the figure aimed at a horizon that does not exist in central London. They are photographing something they already know. Most of them could not tell you the dates of his reign or the name of the treaty that ended his crusade or the castle where he died. But they know the name. Richard the Lionheart. It carries its own weight, independent of the facts attached to it. This is not ignorance. It is what legends are for. A legend is not a biography. A biography tries to tell you what actually happened. A legend tells you what a culture needs to believe happened. The two things are related, but they are not the same. And confusing them is how you end up with a bronze king pointing toward a Jerusalem he never took. Outside a parliament he never entered. In a country he barely lived in. Representing a national character he almost certainly did not possess in the terms that the statue implies. Richard I of England was not English in any meaningful cultural sense. He was Angevin. His mother was from Aquitaine. His father was from Anjou. He grew up speaking Occitan and French. He thought of his French territories as home in a way he never thought of England as home. He visited England twice as king. The first visit lasted 4 months. The second lasted 4 months. The remaining 9 years of his reign, he was somewhere else. The country that put him on a horse outside its parliament chose, very deliberately, to make none of that the point. They chose the sword and the horse and the eastward gaze because those things said something they needed said, that England had always been willing to fight for something higher than itself, that its greatest kings were warriors and visionaries. We not administrators. That the tradition of English power was rooted in the willingness to ride toward the horizon regardless of cost. The cost was Yorkshire. The cost was the Saladin tithe and the ransom silver, and the years of John's misrule that Richard's absence made possible, and the generations of people who paid taxes for wars they would never see, and kings they would never meet, and cities on the other side of the world that meant nothing to their daily lives except the amount taken from them to fund the dreaming. The cost was Berengaria, alone in Le Mans for 30 years, managing her household and her priory and the careful life she built in the absence of the husband who had married her in Cyprus 6 days after fighting his way onto a beach and then moved on to the next thing. And the next thing, and the next thing after that. The cost was Eleanor standing at a dock, watching a ship disappear, and knowing it was the last time and going back to work anyway. Because going back to work was what she had always done, and there was always more work, and the alternative to working was feeling the full weight of what she had built, and what that building had cost her. And Eleanor was too honest and too capable for that kind of stopping. These costs do not appear on the bronze statue. They never do. Now here is the part that tends to surprise people who think they already know this story. The most enduring version of Richard the Lionheart in popular culture is not the crusader. It is not the warrior. It is not even the prisoner or the king. The most enduring version of Richard the Lionheart is an absence. He is the good king who is not there. Robin Hood. The story has existed in various forms since at least the 13th century, which means it started being told within a generation of Richard's death. The specific form it takes changes constantly across 800 years of retelling. From the medieval ballads to the Victorian novels to the Hollywood films to the versions that most Americans grew up watching. But the essential structure never changes. England is suffering under bad governance. The people are being exploited by officials who take too much and give back nothing. A hero emerges from the forest to fight back. And somewhere in the background, present or implied or arriving at the end to set things right, is Richard, the good king, the one who would fix everything if he were here. The story requires Richard to be absent. If Richard were present and governing England, there would be no Robin Hood story. There would be no sheriff of Nottingham collecting impossible taxes. No people desperate enough to need a thief in the forest redistributing wealth. No crisis requiring a hero who operates outside the official structures because the official structures have been captured by people who serve themselves rather than the kingdom. All of that exists because Richard is not there. And here is the thing that 800 years of Robin Hood stories have been very careful not to say directly. The sheriff of Nottingham was collecting taxes that Richard demanded. The people in the forest who needed Robin Hood to steal from the rich and give to the poor were poor, in significant part, because Richard had needed silver for Jerusalem, and then more silver for Cyprus, and then more silver for the logistics of the march from Acre to Jaffa, and then the largest single extraction of wealth in English history to pay his ransom when Leopold of Austria recognized him outside Vienna and understood immediately what he had found. The Robin Hood story is not about John's England. It is about Richard's England, while John was running it in Richard's absence. The good king who is away is responsible for the conditions that the story blames on the bad king who is present. This is not an argument that John was good. John was not good. John was ambitious and untrustworthy and politically ruthless, and eventually forced by his own barons to sign a document limiting royal power that would become the foundation of English constitutional law, which is perhaps the most ironic legacy in the history of bad governance. John created genuine problems that had nothing to do with Richard, but the Robin Hood story does not begin with John. It begins with a kingdom that has been stripped of its wealth and its leadership and its institutional capacity by a king who loved it primarily as a funding mechanism for a war 3,000 miles away. Robin Hood is not waiting for Richard to come home and fix things. Robin Hood is managing the reality that Richard is not coming home, that the fixing is not going to happen from above, and that the forest is full of people who need to eat, regardless of what any king decides to do about Jerusalem. The people in that forest are the Yorkshire farmer who paid the Saladin tithe. They are the soldiers who held their formation on the march from Acre and came home to find their villages poorer than when they left. They are the families who melted their church plate to pay the ransom for a king who thanked them by sailing immediately to France and dying outside a castle nobody remembers. They figured it out themselves. They survived. They built something in the forest that the official record was not designed to capture, which was the daily reality of people who lived in the space that a legend left behind when it rode over the horizon towards something more important than them. And then they told a story about it, and the story survived. And 800 years later, people are still telling it, still finding in it something true about what happens when the powerful pursue their own dreams at the expense of the people who cannot afford dreams of that size. Richard became immortal. The forest is where the real story was. It always had been. The next time you watch a Robin Hood story, pay attention to something that most versions pass over quickly. Richard barely appears. He is mentioned at the beginning, referenced in the middle, or arrives at the end to restore order. He is the fact of the story rather than the presence of it. The whole thing happens in the space his absence creates. Think about what that means. The poor people of Nottingham needed Robin Hood because they needed someone between them and the machinery that was taking what little they had. That machinery ran on taxes. Those taxes were collected, ultimately, to pay for things that Richard had decided were worth paying for, in places he had decided were worth going to, at a cost he had decided the people who stayed behind could bear. He made that decision from across a sea. He made it from a siege camp in the Holy Land. He made it from a prison in Germany. He never stopped to ask the Yorkshire farmer whether the cost was worth it. He never stopped to ask Berengaria whether the life she was going to live was the life she had expected. He never stopped to ask Eleanor whether the thing she had spent 30 years building was the thing she would have built if she had understood, at the beginning, exactly what it was going to cost her to build it. He was too busy becoming what his world needed him to be. He became it completely. And the people who paid for his becoming figured out how to survive in the world he left behind. And some of them went into a forest and built something that had nothing to do with Jerusalem, and nothing to do with Saladin, and nothing to do with any of the enormous and important things that Richard spent his life pursuing. They built something human-sized, and it lasted longer than the crusade. The bronze Richard outside Parliament is still pointing toward Jerusalem. He still has not taken it. The forest is still there. The people in it are still figuring it out themselves. That is not the story Richard intended to leave behind. It is the story he left behind, and we are still living in it.